jump straight into it, or at least back into it, I guess I should say.
Hi, team.
Hello.
Hi, how are you, team?
I'm good. Back to full strength. Yes, thank you so much. I was in bed most of Thursday and Friday, and then slowly over the weekend got better, and yeah. So thank you very much. I feeling good today. Everybody can wish Anna a happy birthday. Today is her birthday. Anna, it's your birthday today, isn't it? You decided to spend your special day with us. We are honored.
I'm not sure if you are talking about me because
Yeah.
I didn't hear the first part. Sorry, but thank you. Yes, I decided to spend my birthday with you guys. It's absolutely a pleasure to,
Yes, it
Thanks,
was. Sorry,
guys.
I tried to wait long enough to where your audio connected, but I must have missed. Missed the point. But yes, happy birthday.
Thank you. No worries.
So today, after today's class, I have 13 samples that I'm cupping. That are so this year. I don't know if any of you have ever been to any of the Coffee Fest here in North America, but at Coffee Fest this year for New York, the center is hosting the sensory education portion, and we're going to be cupping and talking. We're going to do some fermentation class and coffee processing and calibration, do some other events. But I have a friend of mine who sent me some samples from his farm in Hawaii, and different fermentation protocols, low temperature anaerobic with yeast inoculation, no yeast inoculation. And then he also sent me some infused coffees, which I'm interested to try out. And so, anyways, I did all my roasting on my roast. I feel like I don't speak enough like European accent to pronounce that word correctly. But so we'll see how the cupping goes. It'll be interesting to taste them. We have a few more that we're waiting on, and we'll get started. Hey, Tristan, I'm sure you would probably hope by this time you wouldn't be waking up in the middle of the night. Sorry to, hopefully you were able to catch up on some sleep at the end of last week, and hopefully it's not too disruptive to your day.
このミーティングは録音されています。
All right. I know that a few people had mentioned that they might be a little late today. So we are going to jump in and get started. I've gotten some great questions over email, so thank you for people for sending those across. I've tried to answer the ones that were ones that we weren't going to be covering. There were several that we're actually going to be covering over the next couple of days, and we're going to go today and tomorrow, and I know when our Wednesday session got kind of like cut in half very abruptly. So we might need an additional hour on Thursday just to finish things up and then, just provide some time for questions, but we'll see how we progress through. I know I always say that and then I end up talking way too much. I am going to jump back and kind of go back over. We had started a presentation, and I don't feel like I did very well with it. And I again just want to apologize to everybody. My head was so foggy on Wednesday, and I probably should have called it and not tried to push through. So I know that some of the information I presented was probably a little bit seemed like it was this big jumbled mess. That's kind of how it felt in my brain as well. So I apologize about that, and thank you for your patience. But feeling good today and ready to jump back in. So last week we discussed and we covered, basically what is the foundation of how we define fermentation. We looked at several of the different fermentation pathways. We laid a lot of groundwork and foundation that we're going to build upon over the next 2 days. And really what we're going to talk about and specifically go in detail about the next 2 days is how we can take those concepts and translate that and understand into coffee fermentation. Now, as we begin today, I want to remind us that when we say the word coffee fermentation, and even we saw this in the first lesson that we talked about, was even the term fermentation can begin to mean so many different things depending on the industry that you're in, depending on how you're viewing or how you're utilizing that. And so while we understand fermentation as in, like we said, that very strict sense of the microorganisms producing byproducts specifically linked with glycolysis, we also understand that fermentation and the way that it's used in coffee describes a certain step or stage in coffee post-harvest processing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because, it does kind of it is a little bit of a sidetrack from the specific topic we're focusing on. But we understand that post-harvest processing is basically the process that takes a harvested coffee fruit and sees it all the way through to a dried coffee seed that has been graded, sorted, and ready for use by a roaster. Or export, etc. Pre-cleaning is, you kind of see those different steps and those different stages outlined here. But where we see coffee fermentation specifically addressed is in this, if you can kind of see this mucilage removal type or step or unit. People refer to it as a unit operation of post-harvest processing. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can do this and aspects that we can utilize in order to remove that mucilage. We've mentioned it a couple of times throughout our sessions together, the different terminologies and the different terms that people use when describing coffee processing, this post-harvest processing. Now, I throw this chart up there, and if you've taken a Q processing level 1 or level 2 or any other, several of the other CQI courses, you would have seen this. There on the far right hand side, you can see the kind of technical term or more of kind of the common terminology that's used. And I've said this many times, I'm not looking to introduce new terminology, I'm not looking to be the terminology police, but what's happened many times and what's we're seeing kind of in this wave of innovation with processing methods is we're seeing a huge growth in names and terminologies, and honestly, it's difficult to understand, are these describing processes, actual processes? Are they marketing terms? How do we make sense of them? And so your kind of traditional terms of natural process, honey process, mechanically demucilage, fully washed, wet hold, what we've done is we've introduced a system or a way of thinking about these processes that are more rooted to the coffee fruit anatomy and also more kind of understanding or more telling towards what is actually happening or what are some of the potential links to the resulting quality based off of certain biological or biochemical processes that are occurring. So on the left side, you see this CQI classification. The one in the middle there that's linked to drying used to be called the SCA classification. I guess SCA dropped that or don't use that anymore. But essentially, it's all about what layers are removed prior to the coffee being fully dried. But I want to look at the left side, this CQI classification, and it's basically broken down into three different groups. You have whole fruit, which again is just saying that that natural process or that natural method is harvesting the fruit and then putting that out to dry. Now, yes, there's lots of variations that we can give to that. We can ferment a cherry, we can suspend the drying, we can inoculate, we can do all kinds of things to it, utilizing fermentation and different types of fermentation. But we understand that one, not breaking that, not pulping the fruit is going to have a biochemical impact inside of the seed. But then the types of microorganisms that are going to be active, depending on the environment, are also going to differ. And so that's kind of our first major group, is just the whole fruit. Then we get to a distinction on different types of pulped coffee. And just like now, how you see things in research articles kind of describing wash process or wet process and dry process, I really think I hope that we're going to start seeing more kind of processes that would be pulped processes or non-pulped or unpulped. And why is because when we are removing that skin, again, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow more in depth, we are beginning some processes of biochemical response inside of the seed that are going to be a contributing factor to final quality. In addition to that, when we pulp that coffee, we are exposing that mucilage, the mesocarp, to the environment, which is going to have different impacts. And you can see three different potential variations. We can leave the mucilage on, allow it to dry intact, and we would understand that to be kind of your honey process coffee. We can remove some of the mucilage or all of it, depending on the producer's preference or the processor's desire, mechanically. And so that's where we kind of get that mechanically demucilaged process. The third one there, remaining mucilage is removed via biological processes. And this is what traditionally or typically is referred to as fermentation. And I remember when I started in coffee in Yunnan, I always kind of had an issue with this calling or referring to that step as fermentation, because while yes, there is fermentation happening, that wasn't always what people were hoping to achieve or why they were even using fermentation. It was more about trying to break down that mucilage, and it was more of that biological process of mucilage removal. Okay, so we kind of see those as the three main groupings for how we can classify and how we can understand. Now, you would be aware just as much as I would that even as we look at the that biological process of mucilage removal via fermentation, there's heaps of variations we can take on that. But I've used this content this kind of way of thinking often when I enter into discussions about processing methods to better understand and to provide a better framework for what's happening. So and then we have hold, which is that kind of removing of that final layer, the parchment and everything before drying, or before we finish drying rather, and that would be our wet hold processed coffee. So this is a framework, so to say, that you can utilize as we begin to talk about and look at different processing methods. Again, I don't believe that we are, we're not trying to propose a new way to discuss about or name processing methods, so to say, in terms of like on a packaging or on a bag, but it does provide us some context for better discussions about processing methods. A note here about uniformity and risk mitigation. So this would be kind of as part of your pre-cleaning type of steps. And it's mentioned here because we have to, there's we need to remember that in coffee processing, we are looking to, at some level, we're trying to achieve consistency from batch to batch. It is not as common as what I think some people might think to have one day lot of coffee harvested, and that coffee is then processed and stays entirely together and is isolated and sold as an individual lot. Yes, that does happen, and there are, whether because there are they're selling those micro lots or smaller lots, or maybe they're harvesting, a farm or producer is harvesting so much coffee in a single day that they're able to sell that as an individual lot. But more often than not, you have blending that goes on. And even as producers are trying to diversify the portfolio or the products that they're offering, the flavor profiles, they're still trying to achieve a certain degree of uniformity between different batches and mitigate risk of defect development. So really, there's a couple different methods, and again, these would all kind of be factored in that pre-cleaning type of direction. We can use winnowing, which is a type of kind of dust removal and foreign matter removal. We can sieve, which would sort by size. Hydraulic separation is a big one. That's the machine that's going to sort by density, but it's going to be using water. We can do certain size grading and even color sorting. So all of these steps of pre-cleaning are all about achieving a consistent and a high quality starting point for the rest of your post-harvest processing. And, again, I mentioned this here because having consistent results in our fermentations is going to be significantly linked to having good pre-cleaning so that our raw material is at a consistent place. There are so many factors in terms of the microbial load that's coming in with the raw material, and having proper protocols in place to ensure that raw material is as consistent as possible is a huge step in ensuring high quality. We've mentioned this before, but historically, fermentation has referred to that unit operation, to that step where we're utilizing microorganisms to break down the mucilage so that it can be washed away. And that washing away is that kind of washing unit operation. If you recall up here, I'll jump back here to this slide in a minute, but these different steps that you see within that mucilage removal, we have a fermentation unit operation if we're using a kind of a biological means of mucilage removal, and then we have a washing, which is that we're going to talk about some of the different ways that we can do that. But really, historically, fermentation was not viewed as a way to really develop unique flavors. It was more just use it to get the mucilage free, and then don't mess it up in the process. Like, don't over ferment it, don't get off flavors. It wasn't about developing unique flavors. It was just don't develop off flavors. And we have to kind of hold this perspective in view, because the reality is we can't just wash the mucilage off. Now, outside of a mechanical mucilage remover, meaning that if we're going to utilize mechanical means to remove the mucilage, we can do that, but under what I would say is the majority of what people are doing with washed coffee, we can't just wash the mucilage off. And so while it will always be important to utilize fermentation as a means for mucilage breakdown, we're entering into kind of a new, and we've already entered into it, and we're continuing to I guess diversify and to expand upon this idea of utilizing fermentation to develop flavors. The main reason why we can't wash the mucilage off just in those, the density channel or even by hand is because it has pectin. And pectin is it's insoluble in water, and it must be degraded in order to allow for the mucilage to be washed free. And in the coming days, we'll talk about, or the coming lessons, we'll talk about what are some of the different factors that contribute to that pectin being broken down and being able to be washed free. Interestingly, at the ASIC conference, which is like the coffee nerd science conference, one of the speakers, Gerard Bitoff, made a comment. It was during a question and answering session, but he made a comment about in the U.S. and in North America here we have, and maybe we have in other places, I just am not aware of, we have peaches, and there's a certain type of peach that they call a no-cling peach, okay, which essentially when you, most peaches, when you cut open a peach and you have the pit or the seed inside, it's pretty difficult to separate the seed, that pit, from the flesh. It requires quite a bit of work to do that. We have a type of peach here in North America that the seed actually just falls right out. The pit falls right out. It's called a no-cling, cling meaning like something clinging to something else. And his comment was, it would be interesting if we were able to understand what genetic sequence or what genes are responsible for that in coffee. Because if you could imagine a no-cling coffee seed, meaning that you pulp the coffee fruit and the mucilage just automatically separates entirely from the parchment, it would create a situation, interestingly, where you could have even greater control maybe over the fermentation, because you could control the substrate, you could control the food that's being fed to the microorganisms. It also eliminates any barriers. It would cut down on processing. It was an interesting comment he made, and like my mind started going about all the different applications that it could make. The conference was ASIC, and I can't remember science. Yeah, I'll have to look back on what the acronym stands for, but it's an annual coffee science conference. A lot of research is presented. It's pretty fascinating. So in coffee fermentation and how it's used currently, we typically find that there's two different ways that people are fermenting coffee in order to allow for that breakdown of mucilage as well as flavor development. And again, we'll get to some of the variations on some of these, but essentially you have a dry fermentation and what we call a wet or submerged fermentation. Okay, so dry fermentation, if you're thinking about typical process of, let's just say, washed coffee, you're pulping the coffee fruit, and then you have your fermentation tanks. You have your concrete tanks, your tile tanks, whatever they are. And it's basically, dry fermentation is exactly what it sounds like. We're putting that coffee in the tank with no water, and the coffee mass, the parchment with mucilage still intact, it sits there until the mucilage is fluidized and that washing point, and we'll talk more about what the washing point means, but until the washing point is achieved. So, the conditions, I think sometimes we try to make too strong generalizations on what dry fermentation is happening and what's not happening, because you can have dry fermentation that's spread out in this tank that's really long and wide and shallow, or you can have it in a very narrow, deep tank, and both of those systems are going to respond very differently during fermentation. And then you have your wet or your submerged fermentation. Okay, so again, this is where that coffee, the fruit is pulped, it goes into the fermentation tank, and then it's filled with water. So your water becomes a refrigerant. It helps minimize temperature increase. It's also going to create a type of environment in terms of oxygen availability that's going to be different than your dry fermentation. And so, therefore, we would understand that the microorganisms that would be present and facilitating different metabolites is going to, which is going to lead to impacting the final quality. I share this kind of explanation of wet fermentation versus dry fermentation because I'll use it later as we talk about some of the research into how coffee processing is influencing flavor. And I just want to make sure that we all kind of are understanding this as a general concept. I mentioned the washing point. This is one of the key, a crucial kind of control point when we're talking about coffee fermentation. And the washing point is, I mean, it's not necessarily like a fancy term. It's essentially just saying at what point are we washing the coffee? When we're ceasing the fermentation or the progression of that fermentation, we're washing the coffee and we're putting out to dry. I will note, and somebody wrote this and asked me about how we've been talking a lot about fermentation in its use with washed coffee. Fermentation occurs with natural processed coffees, and tomorrow when we get to when we talk more about linking it fermentation to flavor, we're going to talk specifically about naturals. So we're talking about it in the context of wash processing a lot because that's where the term is utilized a lot, in terms of fermentation being that step after pulping before washing. But you can utilize fermentation in many different ways and in many different environments with many different processes. So there's a couple different ways of how we kind of determine the washing point. There's this kind of pole method that's used sometime, and essentially if you put the pole in and then you pull it out, if the hole holds, then the mucilage has been broken down and it's ready to be wash free. The thing about it is all of these methods that are listed here are really focusing on utilizing fermentation as a way to break down the mucilage alone. I would say that these methods, even the texture method or what's the fermaestro, and I'll mention briefly here in a minute what that is. They're all about identifying when the mucilage has been broken down so we can wash free, which is important, and it is one aspect that we might utilize fermentation in this kind of wash process. But it's not necessarily, if we're also wanting to utilize fermentation to develop flavors, to develop certain metabolites and different characteristics, we might use additional means and additional ways to better understand how or what the washing point should be. The Fermaestro there is basically a device that was developed by the FNC in Colombia that utilizes the principle that as mucilage breaks down, a group or a volume of coffee or a mass of coffee will lose volume. So if you take 1 kilo of freshly pulped coffee and you shove it full into this Fermaestro, as that mucilage breaks down, your volume is going to decrease. And so whereas it might start full in the cone and everything's full, by the time the coffee has lost all of its mucilage, it would be at that first ring. Now, this was utilized as a tool by FNC specifically for coffee from Colombia and in certain varieties. So it's not necessarily something that could be used or across all environments or all contexts. But again, it's a tool that you could use that helps you get consistent results on measuring that mucilage breakdown. But again, this is approaching fermentation as a very strict way to break down the mucilage, not necessarily the best way for monitoring when those metabolites and other types of flavor molecules or flavor impact has been fully developed. So just going to talk briefly about the actual washing unit operation. So this is the actual step of washing coffee free, and you can see kind of picture here of your grading channels or washing channels or density channels. I've heard them go by many different names. But typically this is kind of what you find is the traditional way of washing the coffee. So after the coffee has sat in some type of fermentation tank, that mucilage is broken down, then it's usually dumped into these channels, and water is used to wash free. It's a quite labor intensive process, as well as utilizes a lot of water and then creates a lot of wastewater that then needs to be treated. So it's not necessarily the most efficient way of doing this. One of the key aspects of your grading channels is that it does grade out coffee. So you can see here in the photo from Winkins here on the left, basically your proper density or your healthy seeds are going to fall to the bottom, whereas your lower density are going to be lighter. They're going to kind of come up to the top, and then even your floaters, your really light beans, are going to come all the way up to the top. And so you utilize kind of different types of boards and different types of you're pushing the coffee to kind of get it to toss around so that you can separate. So there is a sense where utilizing these density channels is a great way to provide some separation of density. And so you will get kind of grading out of lower quality, higher quality, etc. coffee through these washing channels. So it is one, utilization of these channels that does allow for some quality distinction. The other technology that's used for washing are a couple different devices here. The one on the left, the mechanical demucelator from Pinilense, is a very common, device that's used. I will note that there are some kind of innovative producers that are starting to use these mechanical demucelators after fermentation. So instead of using the channels to wash that mucilage free, they're pulping the coffee, putting it into fermentation tanks or fermenting it for a period of time, and then using the mechanical demucelator to wash that mucilage free. Quicker, more efficient, uses less water, could be a really good option. The centrifuge there in the middle, the Centriflux, is a newer device as well, that's very effective, and it utilizes centrifugal force to remove mucilage, as well as any kind of excess water. These things, the Centrifluxes, are pretty cool too, because you can use them as transport. So like where you might have like a screw auger or a conveyor system, your Centriflux can actually like launch the coffee, and you can connect pipes and things like that. But I believe the advertisement is that it can launch it up to 20 meters in the air. So, if you're wanting to throw it that high, you can. And then your eco washers here, and this is also a newer product by Panagos, that is again utilized after that fermentation process to wash the remaining mucilage free. Haven't had a chance to use those yet. I've seen them, and I'd love to learn. I'm looking forward to learning more about this machine and kind of some of the benefits of it. When this, determining and having clarity on your washing point is crucial to are contributing to quality. If we begin to wash the coffee too soon, the challenge is that you're going to either use a lot of time and a lot of energy, either human or mechanical, to remove all of the mucilage free, or you're going to end up with coffee that's not fully clean. It still has mucilage intact, which, yes, it is when we consider that a honey processed coffee. Yes. However, you're typically not treating it like a honey processed coffee. You're treating it like a washed coffee out on patios or mechanical dryers or other places, but you still have mucilage intact. And that can cause mold or lead to potentially improper drying. Apologize if you hear my child in the other room crying. Nobody's being harmed, I promise. And then if you are if you're stopping and identifying your washing point too late, you're at the risk of producing too much of those metabolites that would then create kind of over fermentation or a ferment defect. You get a lot of kind of, is it really a ferment defect or over fermentation or what? I don't really care what you call it. The reality is we've created off flavors through the fermentation process that we don't want in our final cup. So really the reason I present this concept of a washing point and talking about it is because even as we continue to talk about in our next lesson that we're going to jump into here in a minute is how we control fermentations or monitor fermentations. Identifying that washing point and thinking through the technology we want to use for washing is a crucial step to seeing all of this work and all of this time that we put into discussion on fermentation actually find its way and be able to maintain a high level of quality into the final cup. I'll mention here briefly about soaking. And I believe we've talked about this, we've touched on this, but soaking is that step that happens after washing. That is basically where we're taking the coffee and we're putting it into a tank filled with water. Traditionally speaking, or kind of historically, soaking really came about because producers were needing to hold coffee because there was no space to dry it on the patio. So it was more about patio management. And that kind of became a kind of typical practice. And then and you find it a lot with Kenyan coffee, though I will say that not all Kenyan coffee is soaked, but you did find it being utilized in Kenya first, and then you see it now throughout lots of other regions of East Africa and kind of all over the world as well. Some of the research or some of the experience has been that if you do have certain types of, let's say, harsher characteristics in the cup, soaking will mellow some of that out. So I do have some good friends that are doing a lot of processing of Robusta coffee, and they're finding some benefits to soaking Robusta coffee during a wash process to help kind of decrease some of the harshness in the cup that comes from Robusta. But really the key aspect of why soaking was used was really as a way to kind of preserve or manage your drying space. Yeah, great question. I was just about to say, typically people don't soak for longer than 24 hours. And really, if you're going to soak, you can try it and see how it impacts the quality that you have. I would encourage against doing it for longer than 24 hours. So Swiss water. So the thing about Swiss water decaf is that as I understand it, yes, the coffee is soaked in the green coffee is soaked, but it's soaked in certain, I believe what they call flavor charged water, if I'm not mistaken, to where they're working off the principles of equilibrium, where they basically will there with there being such a high amount of flavor compounds inside the water, they're encouraging or discouraging rather those compounds to kind of leach out into the water and maintain inside the seed, but allow for caffeine molecules to be released. So that's kind of Swiss water, there is a soaking process that occurs at the decaffeination for the decaffeination level. Soak is the same term for double washed. That's my understanding. I mean, once you wash the coffee, there's not really anything else to wash. So I don't really know how else it would be used. But my understanding is that when they do have a kind of that term double washed, it's because they have done a soak after they've washed all the mucilage free. I would not refer to this as a double fermentation. I wouldn't use that term with soaking, because once we remove all of the mucilage, yes, there are microorganisms present in the water, and there could potentially be some compounds that those microorganisms could consume, but you're removing the vast majority of the food for microorganisms, and so would have very limited actual fermentation occurring. So, but yes, I believe that you do see that with double washed. So, with all of the processing methods, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to have some degree of fermentation. Now, we might choose to minimize that impact by maybe removing all of the mucilage, by reducing time, or we might try to change. We might try to manipulate the environment to encourage different types of metabolic pathways. But one thing we need to recall, or one thing we need to keep in mind, is that fermentation, when you have microorganisms, food source, and the right conditions, you have the recipe for fermentation, whether you want it to or not. And really, the kind of intention, so to say, of what we're seeing now with kind of a new wave of coffee processing is the use of fermentation to really generate and develop flavors. Now, the reason why I talked at length about the washing points and kind of some of the monitoring principles is because if we're utilizing and we're looking at fermentation purely at a mucilage removal level, all we're wanting to do is use fermentation to remove the mucilage, I would contend that there really is technology available to be able to do that is more efficient and minimizes the impact to the environment. You know, the note here about minimizing kind of the involvement of fermentation kind of would maybe focus on more of your precursors or your compounds that are developed either inside the plant or during the kind of growth of the seed. I always found it interesting that some of the conversations around pure coffee, or kind of the coffee purists, if you will, really look at wash processing as like the purest way of processing coffee. Well, there's so much about fermentation that's being used in washed coffee that's contributing to flavor. If we really, really wanted to just taste like pure coffee, again, I'm not really sure exactly what pure coffee is, but if you'll allow me to use that term, if we really wanted to have that purest term, then we would mechanically mucilage remove everything, strip it all down, and then dry it, and that would be an indication of just, I guess, pure coffee. But how much? The question of always how much interaction by the processor, is allowed before it begins to be unpure. I don't want to even touch that because it's a very complex and honestly, I think a discussion that we need way more producers and a more balanced representation of the industry. But if we were wanting to minimize the impact of fermentation, we would want to minimize microbes that are present. So we could either do the hydraulic separation or washing, or we could even sanitize. And I'll share some ideas about sanitizing in our next lesson when we talk about controlling fermentation, because really, that's the path of what kind of the wine and beer industry is, that you're minimizing any kind of microbes that are present, and then you're introducing your own. We would want to minimize the food sources, as I said. So, by pulping, but then also by mechanical demucilation, we're removing any of those food sources that would be available for microorganisms. We could also minimize the water, again, because water does carry its own kind of load of microorganisms. But also, if you recall, when we talked about molds need water and oxygen present to really grow and thrive. So by removing kind of the centrifuge, talking about removing that kind of surface water, or even drying in really thin layers, we're going to quickly reduce the moisture that's in that environment, in that system, which is going to lower any kind of microbial activity and minimize the impact of potential fermentation. So in no way am I advocating of saying, look, here's what I think we should do. We need to just completely move away from fermentation. Nobody should be fermenting coffees. Just minimize any impact. The point of sharing this information is to equip you with information and a kind of tools in your tool belt, so to say, of if I am looking to target a market that is wanting a specific flavor profile, or I'm wanting to keep my cost of production within a certain type of of price point, here are some different options available to me. But ultimately, we can also look at fermentation as how we can use that to intentionally generate or intentionally develop flavors in the post-harvest process. And so the remaining lessons, kind of remaining focus that we're going to shift to is talking about what are the different ways that we can monitor or control those processes, and then what type of flavor characteristics, or how can we're going to try to link some kind of microbes and microorganisms to certain types of flavors or certain types of sensory profiles. So the next kind of lesson we're going to jump into is how we control fermentation, but I wanted to give a second just for see if there's any questions that you might have before I jump into the next lesson.
Tim, are you aware of any producer who's ever tried to do what you just explained as being pure coffee? I know that's not your terminology, but do you know of any producer who said, I'm tired of this fermentation, let's just make it 100% pure?
Well, I mean, what I would say is kind of what that is just a mechanically demucilaged coffee. I mean, it's essentially what we're talking about is a semi-wash. Now, I know that terminology is used in many different ways in many different contexts, but if you look at a Brazil semi-washed, it's essentially a coffee that's been pulped, mechanically demucilaged, and usually dried pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, I know lots of producers that are doing mechanical demucilation, and they're not necessarily doing it with an intent to produce a 88, 87 diverse, unique flavor profile type of coffee. They're doing it because they're selling into a market that wants a certain flavor profile of coffee at a certain price point, and they're able to deliver that. So yeah, there are producers that are doing that. I mean, and focusing on using fermentation, or rather minimizing fermentation's impact in the in the final resulting flavor. May I know about what's extended fermentation? Yeah, and we're actually going to get to and discuss quite a bit about extended fermentation in tomorrow's lesson. But essentially, when we talk about extended fermentation, we're talking about attempting to extend the fermentation time in order to allow for more metabolites to be produced, so that it would impact the final quality of the coffee. That's essentially what extended fermentation, what we mean by that. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we jump into linking some microbes to flavors. We'll talk about that. Sure, my pleasure, no problem. So we're going to jump into our where we're going to spend the rest of our time today talking about controlling fermentation. Now, as I was reviewing and looking through this different presentation, I don't know if controlling fermentation is the right word. I think it's more monitoring fermentation. And the reason why is I would say that there is very little controlling fermentation that occurs in coffee, and more monitoring. And I think monitoring is just a better, because really what's happening is we're looking at different variables, different things that are happening, and we're kind of monitoring the fermentation's progression, and then we're choosing to stop it at a certain point, and we wash, and then we cup, and we see what the sensory impact is. But when you talk about controlling fermentation, you're talking about taking a raw material product and thinking about the end, what we want as the end flavor or characteristics, and then controlling the point from A to Z. And you are seeing some of that. I can constantly are amazed at some of the innovations that are happening with bioreactors or different types of stainless steel fermentation tanks, where people are sanitizing, they're removing all the extra outside microorganisms, they're inoculating with their own organisms, and they're producing very, very, very specific flavor profiles and outcomes. To me, that's controlling fermentation. But what we're going to talk about here in kind of this context of controlling is we're going to talk about controlling the different types of population, and ensuring that the population of microorganisms that we want is winning. We're talking about producing the various byproducts that we want in our fermentations, and then also finding ways that we can track their activity so that we can replicate the process. So, in other words, how can we make sure that the right microbes are winning and doing what we want them to do? And that's kind of the balance, I think, between controlling and monitoring that we're talking about. So when we talk about the kind of what we're going to walk through over the remaining portion of today is looking at what different factors influence fermentation. So what are those factors that actually influence fermentation? How can we control those? Or maybe how can we attempt to control those? And then what can we use to measure those different aspects? So we'll talk, and I share this illustration as kind of the picture here of the speed of a car, the accelerator controlling it, and then your speedometer giving us indications of what our speed is. So what we're going to talk about is 6 different factors that are aspects of how we can control fermentation, and then look at ways that we can monitor those. Okay. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the initial population. And when we talk about initial population, we're talking about microorganisms. Okay, so you see here the factor being good versus bad types of microorganisms. And the picture here of your molds, yeast, bacteria as being those 3 key actors, and we've mentioned those and talked about those a lot. But when we talk about good or bad, there's a couple different aspects to that. Are we trying to focus on really quick mucilage breakdown, or are we wanting our fermentation to be slow and actually be extended and develop other flavor characteristics? Well, maybe we want that, but are we sure that the microorganisms that we want to encourage are the ones that are active? Or are there other microorganisms that could be contributing negatively? So that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about this initial population. There's several things we can do to try to control. We'll talk about each one of these individually, and you might be like, what is backslopping? I'll explain that here shortly. And then we'll talk about some different ways that we can monitor an understanding of what those initial populations are. Okay, so again, these initial populations are going to set the tone of what will influence the fermentation process. If we have a large amount of bad microbes, or whether those are molds or those are other negative microorganisms, it's going to be very difficult to compete against that. And what we mean by uphill battle is that if you're starting with a large amount of a microorganism population that's going to bring negative characteristics, we have to take drastic measures in order to try to reduce their impact. And don't forget that water is a huge contributor to that. Not only you think about the bags and the baskets and the environment that coffee processing occurs in, all of that has its own microbial load. And maybe that's good and that's what's contributing positively to quality, but there could also be certain aspects of that are bad, in the sense that they're bringing about negative characteristics in the cup and negatively influencing the product. So the first thing that we can consider in terms of ways to control the initial population is to clean, sanitize, and sterilize. Now, I understand that some of this might not be practical. Okay, so I want to be cautious here. I'm not necessarily laying out for you a prescription on how to process your coffee. I'm more so giving you the tools or understandings of what are some things, how are some different ways we can control for you to consider. Cleaning not only includes like cleaning your tanks. We at the washing station that I ran in Yunnan, we started out with concrete tanks. so just kind of like unfinished concrete tanks. And we actually tiled all of our tanks because we felt like it gave us a better way to clean or to keep the tanks clean. We even did some comparisons where we took stainless steel and we lined the insides of our tanks with stainless steel. I didn't really see any significant difference between the two, just anecdotally. The big difference, though, is that stainless steel is just easier to clean and it's easier to keep clean. So the consistency point was one, that is used. The other part of cleaning is what we talked about, that pre-cleaning of your raw material. So even just, making sure that your raw material is in a place where it's clean in terms of any kind of dirt or other types of foreign matter is removed, as that can all carry its own microbial load. You could sanitize, reduce the number of microorganisms. You can even you can do like a disinfectant type of solution to sanitize the environment and even sanitize the raw material. Or you could even go to the extent of sterilizing, to where you're removing all microorganisms, positive, negative, removing all of them. And there's different ways you can achieve that. I'll share a few of those here with you. You can use hydrogen peroxide as a sterilizer. You could also heat. You can use heat for like a very high temperature for a very short period of time. Will also sterilize. And then there's food grade sanitizers that you can use in the environment. I also have heard of citric acid being utilized as a sterilizer. So that's something that you could consider as well. But essentially, what you're doing with sterilization is you're removing all microorganisms from the environment, and then with the understanding that you would then be adding some kind of microorganisms back in that you wanted to dominate or control the fermentation process. The next control that we would see is this hydraulic separation, which I've mentioned previously. Hydraulic separation is going to be using water to separate the coffee by density. And we talk about hydraulic separation as this machine, which it is, but it's also, hydraulic separation is also when you fill a bucket with water and you stick coffee fruit in a bucket. That's hydraulic separation. It's just using water to separate by density. It's not going to separate ripeness. And I hear so many times people say, oh, we float the coffee fruit to separate ripe and unripe. That's not true. You're actually not doing that. You're not separating ripe and unripe. You're only separating based off density. And what you are separating out, those things that are going to float, are your foreign material. You can see here sticks, twigs, all this kind of stuff, which again is going to carry with it its own microbial population, as well as your low density coffee fruit, which could be disease ridden, have insect damage, or different kinds of fungus, etc. Again, which is going to contribute to your fermentation environment, fermentation process. What's going to sink is going to be your unripes, semi-ripes, and ripes, but you're going to have a little bit more consistency in terms of your microbial population. What is vanos? Never heard of it. I actually don't know, Tristan. I don't speak Spanish. Unfortunately, I wish I did. I don't know if that's another term for pea berry. I'm just kind of totally guessing. But I don't know. Maybe somebody who I usually get made fun of pretty bad because I've lived in Texas for so long and I don't speak Spanish. But yeah, sorry about that. So again, the different impact to what hydraulic separation is going to do, it's going to physically, it's going to remove microbes, so it's going to lower some of our microbial load. It's also going to decrease temperature, which is a very important part, because when you have coffee fruit coming in, maybe you've got to, we have to keep in context that there's different situations, right? There's one person who might be processing their own coffee from their own field. You've got a lot more control over when it's harvested and how long it's been sitting there. And then you have other situations where you have a washing station that's buying coffee fruit from several harvesters, several area, and this harvester left the coffee out in the sun and it started to ferment, and this people, this harvester didn't. And so you have all these different situations that can occur. And the important part is creating a consistent environment so that all of the fermentation is kind of starting and progressing from the same point. You also get some separation on fruit by maturation, but not necessarily like ripe and unripe, but more your overripe. So those that are dried on the tree, which do present a higher risk of mold and could even have, be carriers of mold. Vanos equals empty beans. In coffee language, it equals floaters. Okay, cool. Thanks, Ibrahim. I feel like I've now learned and grown, expanded my coffee Spanish vocabulary. Thanks. And so if, again, we already mentioned about sanitizing, but the lowering your microbial load, decreasing your temperature, and it has a note here about increasing your lag phase. And if you remember, that lag phase is kind of getting your microorganisms going in terms of their growth and development. It might increase the lag phase, but it also might keep your fermentation from kind of getting out of control. And that's where what I've found is when we don't use water to kind of wash the coffee or to float the coffee or whatever when it comes in to the washing station, one of the biggest impacts I find is that it causes a really fast fermentation to get going. And if I'm wanting to use fermentation to develop flavors and develop characteristics, fast fermentations are not necessarily always your best friend. They're not necessarily always conducive to that. So by soaking or floating or using a hydraulic separation, we decrease that temperature and allow for a kind of a more controllable progression of microorganism development. The other control point is your water. And I think I mentioned this before as well, but I don't see a lot of research being done on water for coffee processing. It would be really interesting to